I'm Rachel Bovard.
I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts, on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or, anywhere else. So welcome back, everybody. We have a bunch of topics we're going to cover today, including some breaking news about the Sussman Verdict, which Ben is going to cover for us at the end of the show. But before we get to that, Emily's going to talk about some sort of woke Stasi double jeopardy going on at Princeton. I'm going to talk about big tech's latest gambit all the way to the Supreme Court. Josh is going to fill us in a little bit more about the fallout from police behavior in Uvalde, Texas. And then, like I said, we'll circle around to Ben, who will give us some insight on the latest on Sussman. So with that, I will kick it off to Emily.
Yeah, I guess we'll sort of start in the abstract and move to the granular over the course of the show today. I want to start by talking about the saga of Joshua Katz. He's a classics professor at Princeton, or was a classics professor at Princeton, who after a years-long saga has been fired. Tenured professor, fired from Princeton. And the school says it's over his failure to, he was fired over his failure to properly disclose a consensual relationship he'd had with a student. And that came out during a Title IX investigation. But I think what's really important is the Title IX investigation itself happened because he committed wrongthink, because Joshua Katz, who'd been teaching at Princeton for a long time, he's a classics professor, first committed wrongthink. And then what happened is the price he paid was this Title IX investigation, and was this digging up everything, like just scrutinizing everything he had ever done and using it to push him out of academia. His wife penned a really fascinating piece for Barry Weiss's Substack, What Princeton Did to My Husband, I think was the title of it, in which she sort of goes through all of this. She walks through, obviously from a very biased but helpful, detailed perspective, his career, and how their own relationship evolved. She was a student of his, but they didn't start to become romantically intertwined until after she had graduated. So all of this is to say, the reason I wanted to talk about this case study is because it shows, the impossibility, or the seeming impossibility, of getting ourselves out of this rut, this intellectual rut that we're in, because what Princeton did was hold his scalp up, basically, and they would never use that language because they would get fired for wrongthink. But they're holding up the scalp and saying, this is the price you pay for committing wrongthink. He basically had originally just written a piece for Quillette that got him in trouble, pushing back on some of the very woke demands for racial justice at Princeton. He agreed with some of them, disagreed with others, was accused of flagrant racism by somebody who was a student he had once helped. And so all this is to say, if you want to push back on anything, your entire life will be nitpicked and subjected to scrutiny, that I'm sure he would say he did something wrong in the early 2000s in the relationship that got him in trouble. In fact, I know he would, because his wife said he told her as much. But to use it in this way to punish somebody for having the audacity to engage in a good faith debate about without anything like a good faith debate, you can't even do that. And our helpful producer says here, he was punished, and indeed he was. He was suspended for a year without pay. So all of this is to say, he paid the price. He paid a reasonable price for that relationship, and for that consensual relationship. And all of this is just about the wrongthink. So how can we possibly move past this when the price is your job? And I submit this question to you with one additional add-on, which is, does the Joshua Katz's, does that embolden others in his situation? Are we heading into an era where people will be sort of newly emboldened to live not by lies? Is that where we are now, or are we going in the other direction because the price is so steep?
There was one detail in this story that really troubled me, and Emily, you might have to correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but based on the Substack that his wife put out, it seemed like a lot of this sort of reevaluation of something that had already been punished was pushed by the students themselves. Like there was a piece put into the whatever the student newspaper is at Princeton that was so like flagrantly violative of journalistic norms and standards that I think someone even in the New York Times like called it out, like this should never have been published. And that was sort of fueling a lot of the, fatwa against him, for lack of a better term. And, to me, this speaks of a really disturbing trend that you constantly are seeing now in universities where like the adults are not in charge. You have these sort of students demanding a head on a pike based on, feelings of, microaggression or whatever it is, however they're characterizing it. And someone needs to be the adult and just be like, this is not how we treat people, right? Something that he's admitted that was wrong, he was punished for. There is nothing more to do. You are actively just trying to ruin this person's life, but more and more, that's the price you have to pay. And there was I just want to quote from his wife's Substack because I thought this was so illustrative of the incident. And I'm quoting, she writes, "And then there is the chilling message Princeton has sent to Joshua's colleagues and to academics everywhere. Step out of line politically and we will find a way to bring you down. Show us the man and we'll show you the crime." End quote. And, again, I just come back to this idea, and we've talked about this theme before, where so many of us mock or did mock what happened in universities, as just a joke, right? These are kids being stupid. And then the real world, they'll get mugged by reality. Well, no, they're exporting this to the world. They will now run your HR department. And what's happening in universities is a foreshadowing of what's to come in our corporate class and our leadership class. And so somehow I think this has to be stopped. And I think this is as much cultural as it is, how we talk about addressing it from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on this story, so I'll try to keep them fairly quick. First of all, there's a few op-eds I'd like to flag. So Joshua Katz himself had a really, I thought, very, very good piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think the day after Princeton made its final decision. The way that he kind of frames his argument is in terms of kind of cultural double jeopardy. I'm going to get back to that in just a second there. On a shameless self-promotion plug, my friend Paul de Quinoy has now had 2 excellent op-eds for Newsweek's op-ed section, kind of tracing this saga. So I would encourage you to check out those 2 pieces as well. But going back to the way that Joshua Katz framed his own kind of sordid affair in the Wall Street Journal here, he kind of uses the rhetoric of double jeopardy. And my takeaway for that is I kind of trace a direct line from what happened to Brett Kavanaugh with respect to innocent until proven guilty until this. In each instance, there is one kind of form of argument that looks at whether it's innocent until proven guilty or kind of double jeopardy and says, oh, that's a purely kind of legalistic procedure. That's purely a civil law, common law, natural law, US Constitution, whatever. It has nothing to do with kind of the way we should operate as far as being decent human beings. But back in Kavanaugh, I certainly personally rejected that. I think a lot of conservatives did. I think we should reject it here too. Whether it's kind of innocent until proven guilty, whether it's kind of this notion of double jeopardy. These are not just kind of black letter, abstruse, arcane legal doctrines. These are basic norms for how humans ought to behave with one another, for how humans ought to comport with one another. And to Emily's point, he did serve his time. He was literally punished for a year without pay. So this is 100% double jeopardy. If you actually think that Princeton is firing him for what he did with his consensual relationship years ago and not for his very accurate statements in the aftermath of the George Floyd riots going back 2 years now, then, I have a house in Wichita to sell you. That's obviously just not what's going on here. But, this, the last thing I'll say on this, because I don't want to filibuster for too long, is this, I think, should just accelerate kind of what Rachel is saying, the need for conservatives to kind of ultimately effectuate a full and total divorce from the American higher education system. And whether that means kind of public policy reforms that channel more money, kind of channel more talent away from the universities into trade schools, vocational training, community colleges, things like that. Or ideally, whether we kind of get more, more donor dollars to build up at least some of our own institutions. Real quick, I was at a Beckett Fund, their Black Tie Gala here in South Florida last Thursday. They gave their annual prize award to the president of this small Catholic school in North Dakota I never even heard of, University of Mary, I think it was called. And the president kind of what won the Becket Fund's annual award. He was awesome. It was a great speech. It was super based, like totally anti-woke. We need more universities like that, whether they're strictly sectarian, secular, or whatnot.
Yeah, so I agree that there's both a cultural and policy aspect to this. We have a rotten culture, which is which was the fertile soil for a neo-Maoist anti-cultural revolution that we've seen, ironically, in this case, which it was accelerated by the summer of 2020, the BLM riots. And so it's fitting that Katz's head is on a pike as a consequence of comments associated with that, because this is the natural end of that neo-Maoist revolution that we've been suffering under for the last 2+ years. So I think on the one hand, it's rotten culture within these campuses, but on the other hand, there is a policy element to play here. So Josh raises one aspect, obviously, which is competition from without. There are ways in which, particularly, of course, public institutions, if the state is going to be literally invested in and overseeing those institutions, legislators can impose and implement policy changes that do begin to counter the rancid policies and prescriptions in these places. And then, of course, there's the donors within these schools as well, the private institutions, on top of the fact that, of course, many private institutions, of course, get governmentally handed out privileges. So there are a lot of different levers that can be pulled here. But at the end of the day, this comes back to what kind of society do we want to live in? Are we living in? Are people raising their children in to believe that people ought to be destroyed for holding views that you disagree with? Because at the end of the day, that's where we are. This is obviously all in bad faith. And the chilling effort, and I think this is a point well taken by Mr. Katz, Professor Katz's wife, that's what this is all about. This is to send a signal to anyone: you step out of line, you will be destroyed. And we see this now in every single strategically significant, influential aspect of our society. It has to stop. And there has to be real consequences to that neo-Maoist behavior. Until there are, this is only going to continue, accelerate, and get far worse.
And just before we transition, I'll add, this has been happening for years, and that's the problem. It's how we ended up with a Joshua Katz, because it's been happening all over the country for years and years. This just happens to be a high-profile extreme example.
Well, speaking of more censorship, let's talk about big tech, my favorite censorship topic. For people paying attention to this, while Congress has sort of fiddled on the big tech question, the states have been very actively aggressing on the issue. And there are two sort of marquee laws, one pushed by Texas and one pushed by Florida, to try and address sort of the censorship angle of big tech. And I'm just going to focus on the Texas law today, because that is one where we've actually seen, obviously any attempt to legislate the state level, big tech swoops in and tries to kill it immediately. Well, this one they've been unsuccessful in doing, in crushing. The Fifth Circuit recently ruled against big tech when it said, look, we're going to allow this Texas law to move forward, because big tech had demanded an injunction. They said, no, we're going to let this move forward. Big tech immediately, through their trade association, NetChoice, appealed to the Supreme Court. They made an emergency application to the Supreme Court on par with, execution stays, because that's how critical they think that this law is against them. And I want to make just 3 high-level points about it. I'll leave it to Josh to get into the legal weeds if he wants, but I think it's an important issue to discuss for a couple of reasons. The Texas law itself, all it says is that big tech platforms cannot engage in viewpoint discrimination on the basis of, they're effectively common carriers. It recognizes the role they play in facilitating public discourse, and it says, look, you have to treat all comers equally. Now, it does say you can still ban for content, right? And what that means is, content already illegal under federal law, like incitement to violence, things like that, things already legal under Section 230, harassment. You can ban categories of content, but you cannot discriminate based on viewpoint. The example I love to use is the difference between nudity and naturism, right? You can ban people from posting nude pictures, but you can't ban advocates of naturism from talking about how much they love, like going to beaches or whatever, right? So there's a difference here. And it's been fascinating to watch this for a couple of reasons. First, I think it really exposes the legal loophole or the legal ambiguity that big tech has been exploiting for decades now, which is to say, oh, well, under Section 230, we're not publishers. We're not liable for what our users say. If kids are being sex trafficked on our platform, it's not our responsibility. And what they're arguing now, which is that, oh, yes, we are definitionally First Amendment actors with an editorial right to censor whatever we want. They're literally arguing contradictory points. And the Texas law and the Texas AG's office has been, I think, very good about pointing this out. You can't have it both ways. And so whether or not the Supreme Court's going to weigh on that question, I don't know, but I think it's a very important contradiction to expose here. But the second thing that's been fascinating to watch about this is if you've ever actually seen a corporate interest engage on all cylinders in Washington, this is how it works. Big tech has been planning for this moment for decades. As soon as this law made it past the Fifth Circuit, you saw every nonprofit group they pay in Washington cite the same talking points in op-eds all over the city. You saw a pile of amicus briefs immediately filed with the courts. Well, myself and a couple of others in sort of the ragtag band of tech skeptics on the right were left like completely scrambling. We couldn't even find a law firm that wasn't conflicted out because everybody represents Google in Washington. So it's just been, the David versus Goliath scenario of taking on the tech giants has been very evident, even in the fact that they appealed to the Supreme Court shadow docket. And I'm interested in Josh's take on this as well, because to me, this is, again, it's arrogant, but it's also desperate, because what they're trying to avoid here, again, is not egregious injury. What they're trying to avoid is this law simply going forward. No one's ruled on the merits. They just don't want this law to go forward, because what happens if it does? Discovery. And what do we find out then? How they actually moderate content. We find out how many times they've worked with the government to censor certain viewpoints. So I just kind of throw this out there. This has gone a little bit under the radar, I think, obviously, because there are complex questions at issue here, but I'm interested in everybody's thoughts, even to the point where, NetChoice argued this was a slam dunk First Amendment case, but it's clearly not, because it's been several weeks and the court has yet to say anything about it. So I'll open it up and leave it there.
So I think there's a lot to unpack there, obviously, but I guess what I'll choose to focus my particular comments here on is on the notion of the shadow docket in general. This is kind of an in the weeds, kind of legally arcane topic that I think is starting to burst out into the open. And this case is a good example, I think, as to why it is important that they get out there. So to kind of ditch the legal nomenclature and just say what's going on here. So the standard way that a case gets obviously argued and decided at the United States Supreme Court is there are briefs from the parties. There are lots and lots of amicus briefs, depending on how, of what import the case is. And then there's oral argument, of course. And then, some time later, there will be a decision on the merits. The shadow docket is basically a way of expediting a decision without that full process. So the parties, depending on, on what they subjectively deem how important the case is to issue a ruling for purposes of national unity, or whether it's like a national immigration border injunction or something like that, they will massively expedite the timeline for briefing, and they will generally decide without the benefit of oral argument. So this has been kind of an issue that I think has attained a lot of attention from the legal academy for the past 5-6 years, as the justices have devoted a higher and higher proportion of their cases to the shadow docket and not kind of the general merits docket. It's a fairly recent phenomenon. There's not like a long history of the Supreme Court kind of dividing its attention in this system. Look, the obvious thing to say about this is that it's not the way that it should be done. This simply is just not the way that Supreme Court cases ought to be decided. And it kind of raises the question as to, are there questions of legitimacy, obviously, that get raised when the justices are issuing a decision, especially with this kind of fictitious notion of judicial supremacy, which I've ranted about a million times before, where the justices, what they say kind of binds the whole country as opposed to the parties to the lawsuit. So if we accept the fiction of judicial supremacy, I think it further militates against the proliferation of the shadow docket. So I think if this case is really kind of raising kind of, the non-legal world, like the mainstream world's attention to the shadow docket, I think it's valuable for that sake.
All right, so I'll be brief here. I would commend everyone to read Phil Pamberger's piece in The Federalist. He wrote a really good op-ed about the strategy here, and I'll just quote a little bit from it briefly and then turn it over to Emily. He says, "Why would the platforms, based upon his reading of their arguments here, makes so many cruelly erroneous or at least misleading statements to the Supreme Court, and writes, the answer lies in what appears to be their strategy to bum rush the Supreme Court. The claims of irreparable harm in an emergency have no basis in fact, because the relevant portions of the statute are without damages remedies. Platforms could easily just wait for private claims against them to wind their way through the regular process of the courts with time for detailed inquiry. But that's precisely what the platforms cannot afford. And he goes on to say, it's not just their arguments are weak, they're worried about discovery. If by claiming an emergency, they can elicit discouraging words from the court about the Texas law, the platforms can escape in-depth discovery that would otherwise occur in private suits against platforms. So they seek accelerated special proceedings to avoid what eventually would be full discovery and to avoid careful scrutiny of their erroneous claims. And to get those fast-moving proceedings, they make specious claims of irreparable harm. It would be shameful for the Supreme Court to decide the constitutional questions in these circumstances. Emergency proceedings are no substitute for careful deliberation. What is needed is the ordinary and orderly due process of law. Speaks for itself. It's brazen what's happening here. It's readily apparent for all to see. What does big tech fear? The question answers itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I would say. And the benefits of some of these legal battles is, as Rachel mentioned, just everything, not everything, but a lot of information being exposed that might sort of in a legal case narrowly be helpful to whatever company is on the other end of this, but in the broader picture is like wildly unhelpful to their cause. And so the more we learn about the business practices and the lobbying practices of these companies, the less the public is going to care about the granular legal nitpicking that the sort of libertarian tech defendants are breathlessly doing. And I think that's as helpful as anything. And I was just going through this case myself last week and kind of trying to understand it because I was editing a piece about it. And I was just like amazed at some of the like libertarian pushback. It was just to see the defenses of these companies be at this point in time. It seems so completely bizarre to me, given that they're crony capitalists who are having a negative effect, not just on the markets, but on the culture. And so it's like a proxy war, between like conservatives and libertarians. I get it, but I actually honestly don't understand, even from like a libertarian perspective. Like Section 230 is a privilege conferred by the government. It's not a God-given right to the corporations that are people, my friends. And so it just kind of, to me, I genuinely think these are crony capitalist companies, and like the libertarian, if you care about a true sort of system of free enterprise and capitalism, you have to tend to the weeds. And I just pushing back on efforts to do that as though it's a calling card for true libertarianism, I really don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, just to quickly wrap up on this, and I'll transition to myself, I guess. The way that Philip Hamburger, Ben mentioned him, but the way that he has kind of phrased the common carrier Section 230 argument, and I personally find it very compelling. The way that common carriage law traditionally works, going back to English common law, going back to Sir Matthew Hale, centuries and centuries ago, was that you would get some form of extra legal immunity in the case of kind of railroads or carriages or some sort of transportation. It was oftentimes extra legal tort immunity in exchange for a non-discrimination provision. So the basic argument that I think Phil Hamburger makes is that Section 230 is that carrot. There is just no stick. And that stick ought to come in the form of common carry regulation, which is basically what the Texas statute is trying to do. So, okay, let's transition. We can come back to that in final thoughts if we want to. So let's talk a little bit more about the Uvalde shooting and the aftermath of that, which we, of course, discussed a little bit last week when it was still, when it was very much kind of still fresh in the minds of all of ours. And I think the story is going to be fresh in our minds for a ways to go, just given the more that we learn about what happened there in Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. So at the time we recorded this podcast last week, I'm not sure we had all the information that we now have about the conduct from the Uvalde police officers who were there on the scene, and I didn't think we had the full timeline. So long story short, so the shooter arrives at the school around roughly 11:30 a.m. or so. He was not ultimately taken down until close to 1 p.m. local time. I think it was roughly 12:50 p.m. or so. And for a few days, I mean, last Wednesday through Friday, when we were finally divulging all this information, I did like a little Twitter thread on it. For a period of time, there it literally seemed like each new revelation, each new headline was more galling, more appalling, more shocking to the conscience than the one before that. It really has made me viscerally angry in a way that I frankly have not been about a story in a long time, honestly. And again, part of that's just biographical. My mother's an elementary school teacher. This stuff just really kind of hits home. But what we now know is that at one point there were 19 police officers standing basically outside the hallway who did not go in to take out the shooter. It turns out that the agents who ultimately took the shooter down were Border Patrol agents. They were not police officers. They were from the Bortat Division of Border Patrol. They had gotten there. And if I have this story correctly, they basically spent a half hour following the instructions from the local police officers in charge on the ground, which at the time were confined to basically trying to shepherd children away from the frenzy. And then after about a half hour, these two agents, I think, basically kind of, again, y'all correct me if I'm wrong here, they basically kind of looked at one another and were like, what the hell are we doing here? I mean, like, there's an active shooter in there. Why are we not taking him out? And they went in and took him out. Look, I understand if you are, I kind of understand. I mean, I kind of understand if you are one person and what you have is like a 9mm handgun and like you hear someone in there with like with a rifle, you know, having some trepidation, obviously. When there are 19 police officers, 19, there is, I'm sorry, there is just zero excuse whatsoever. And at a press conference last week, after the facts started to come out here, Governor Greg Abbott used the word livid. He said he was livid at the facts as he learned as they came out. Texas DPS, the Department of Public Safety, they have now formally said that the police acted irresponsibly and contrary to the way that they were supposed to act. The Biden DOJ has opened a federal investigation into what happened there. Normally speaking, when the federal DOJ, when the DOJ opens investigation to police contact, you know, the hairs in the back of my neck start to raise up a little bit. I kind of start thinking about kind of intersectionality and police brutality and all this total left-wing garbage. And I do fear that there is possibly that element of this, obviously, because there are a lot of bad faith actors who try to glom on to all elements of police misconduct to defund the police, disarm the police, whatever. And I personally like back the blue as far, you know, as hard as basically anyone out there. Like I've done so repeatedly in lots of public debates, qualified immunity, you name it. But I think it is still incumbent even upon those of us like myself who are so consistent in defending the police to say that what happened here was bad. It appears to be very, very bad. And, you know, in one of my group chats, I mean, some of the solutions that were being floated out as to the proper remedy for some of these cowardly police officers, you know, probably a little too un-PC for this particular podcast, but I guess we could say that they were medieval solutions, you might say. But surely we need some sort of accountability here. And I guess I just toss it open on that. What does and what should that accountability look like? I guess if you guys agree with me that it really is as bad as it seems to be.
I think there's speaking of the timeline, the one thing that is just, I can't get out of my head, at worst, the drive from the Uvalde Police Department to Robb Elementary is 6 minutes. And what happened is they got a 911 call that there was a gunman shooting, like he was shooting in the area of the school at the funeral home across the street at 11:30. The police do not arrive until 11:44 and then don't end up in the school until 4 minutes after that. So how on earth, the crash was at 11:28. So at 11:30, there's a 911 call. So the police are aware of it. They're 6 minutes away, just the people at the department, let alone the people that are dispatched around Uvalde. So 6 minutes at absolute worst, that should be your response time here. You have 7 minutes, but it takes 14 minutes. That's incredible. The door is open because a teacher propped it. I mean, there's so many things in this case study that went wrong, that it just is a perfect storm for what happened. It's unthinkable, but the negligence on the part of the police department is the most unthinkable part of it. It's incredible. Even just the response time before they're in the building and not getting into the classroom, which, by the way, they ultimately got into by unlocking the door with a janitor's key. What takes you an hour to decide that you should just try unlocking the door? It's insane. So, I mean, it's the same thing. It's Scott Israel all over again. And if people remember the negligence we learned about in Parkland, I don't know. I honestly don't know what the solution is, because we continue to have these problems over and over again, whether it is the shooter themselves or the laid back response time, or the laid back response, or just the insufficient response. And I'll just close by saying, when we were talking about this on Rising on Friday, my co-host Ryan Grimm said something like very poignant. And he was like, we need to, like, Andy Griffith, Andy would have rushed in there. And he said Barney Fife would have rushed in there. And that might sound silly, but there's just something so sick and wrong in our country that we don't have men. We don't, I mean, it's just like, we don't have men. We don't have morale in police departments. We don't have communities. There's just so much going wrong that's overwhelming to even try to figure out, for me, what this should look like. I have a hard time speaking about it in non-abstract ways.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I think it's well said, because there's only one response to I think this entire story and the details that continue to leak out, and that's revulsion. And I think there's a detail that really bothers me when the police are like, well, they might have gotten shot. There was an active shooter and there was gunfire. Well, yeah, that's a decision you make when you become a law enforcement officer. Like you put yourself in harm's way. If you're not prepared to do that, don't sign up to wear the badge. And I think that's just baseline. But I think, even more broadly, it speaks to this notion of, something that's, I think, been creeping since frankly, the riots in 2020, which is that the police aren't necessarily going to protect you. I mean, there's a little bit of that good guy with the gun theory that infuses the right. We're always like, oh, as long as somebody has a gun, then we're safe. And it's not always true. The police, we saw the police stand down in the face of riots. We've even seen around the DC area, the smash and grab stuff that's been still going on, right? And the police just haven't done anything. And so I think, fortunately or unfortunately, I think you're going to see another spike in gun sales, as people begin again to understand that even in the toughest of states, Texas always holds itself up, as sort of the masculine ethos of America, the cowboy, community of the country. You still have men that will cower in the face of what I just can only describe as pure evil, violence perpetrated against children. So, as we debate the Second Amendment, I think again and again, we are just, our faces are forced into the fact of why it exists. From, there's a line from Kyle Rittenhouse to this, where people have to stand up and defend themselves, unfortunately. And thank God we live in a country that protects that right.
Yeah, and of course, you probably all saw that Canada is basically trying to destroy whatever vestige of a gun industry, gun trade it has there in the wake of this. And first, to Josh's narrow question about accountability, I suspect there are probably some laws on the books in Texas that might point to negligence here, at least by the commanding officer, who it seems like was calling the shots on the ground when this massive, deathly incompetence unfolded. So I suspect that there is some probably legal accountability that will happen there, but whatever is going to be proposed ultimately by the federal government after the DOJ probes this, I shudder to think about what that response will be. And I think my broad takeaway, and I felt this from the start of this story, is the more we learn, the more we see that at every level, there was not only rank incompetence, but deathly incompetence when it comes to, why was this person out and about, able to obtain weapons? Where was his family during his childhood? All of the psychosis related issues here, the societal related issues, then to the incompetence of the purported authorities. Where was the guard that was supposedly supposed to be posted up at the school that allegedly had been there, but then wasn't? In every single level, there is just rank incompetence here and failure. But the response from the other side to the incompetence is, let's assault your natural right to defend yourself. That is the response. And that is a remarkable response, particularly when we're talking about a time where the cops, in many cases, have stepped back. And they've stepped back in those cities which have the most stringent gun rules and regulations. So the police won't protect you, and you're not allowed to protect yourself. And that is the most remarkable part of all of this. In a society with crazed people where you're talking about police backing off, what is the response? Disarm law-abiding Americans in the face of it. It's a remarkable commentary and a devastating one. And so on that note, I guess I'll turn to another remarkable and devastating commentary, which is that we just got word of this, the verdict being handed down in the case of Michael Sussman, which was an acquittal. Probably not necessarily surprising to viewers of and listeners to this podcast. So I'll give kind of my brief off the cuff reaction to it, and then I'm curious about your all's reaction to this as well. As I had written in Newsweek last week, this was a case of Michael Sussman truly going in front of a jury and a judge of his peers here. This was the swamp adjudicating a case of a swamp creature, Hillary Clinton's campaign lawyer, the charge of lying about bringing garbage, dirt on this purported link between the Trump organization and Russian Alpha Bank via a server in Trump Tower, that there were some back channel communications there, and that this was part of the whole treasonous Trump-Russia collusion conspiracy. Michael Sussman took that dirt first to the FBI and later to the CIA, but he was indicted for taking it to the head counsel for the FBI in a text message the night before. And I'll try to pull up quickly here the exact quote, but this was sort of the ultimate smoking gun. And Durham did not put this in his original indictment, which in part hurt his case, I believe. And this may have been statute of limitation related, which points to potentially incompetence here on the part of Sussman, or an error, clearly. So the night before this meeting where he brought this dirt to the FBI counsel, he says, Jim Baker he's referring to, it's Michael Sussman. I have something time sensitive I need to discuss. Do you have availability for a short meeting tomorrow? I'm coming on my own, not on behalf of a client or company, want to help the Bureau. And then the next day he goes into this meeting and Baker testifies, quote, he was 100% confident. Sussman told him in the meeting he was not there on behalf of a client. He was there. He was representing two people when he brought this dirt to Baker. One, the Hillary Clinton campaign, which pushed for the dirt to be unleashed. And two, Rodney Jaffe, who was the tech researcher, mastermind of the operation to build this dirt and present it to the campaign and then spin it out both to the government as well as to the media, which they did, as they did with the Steele dossier and other matters. So this was a lie. This was obviously a material lie, because if you say you're not bringing this on behalf of anyone, you're just a good Samaritan who happens to be buddy with the head counsel for the FBI because you worked in the DOJ for a long time prior to it. And of course, you're representing the Hillary campaign. It's a lie, and it's a material lie to know that you're representing a campaign and bringing obviously opposition research to them, misleading them, wasting the DOJ/FBI's investigatory and prosecutorial resources, etc. Yet he was acquitted. Why was he acquitted here? Well, again, look who was adjudicating this case. The judge, as I've detailed in this case, in this piece in Newsweek, himself was a professional acquaintance of Michael Sussman, the accused. They overlapped at the Clinton DOJ. The judge's wife herself contributed $2,700 to the Clinton 2016 campaign. She represents Lisa Page in private practice, who supposedly may be a target of the Durham special counsel. And then we have the jury itself, several of whom were Hillary Clinton 2016 donors, it appears. One spouse worked for 2008 Hillary campaign. Michael Sussman's daughter plays on the team of the daughter of one of the members of the jury. I mean, it's remarkable. It's only in the swamp could this possibly happen. So what's the big story here at the end of the day? To my mind, it's that there is no justice when you're talking about the swamp, judging the swamp. But beyond that, this was a clear, blatant case of a lie and a material lie. And even that couldn't be adjudicated. Yet every single person and their mother in Trump world gets destroyed by the law. Even if they're not convicted, they're ruined, they're bankrupted, their careers are over, their reputations are tarnished and smeared. And this is the ultimate in injustice. There's going to be another case in October. Igor Danchenko, the supposed lead researcher behind the Steele dossier, and he's charged, I believe, on 5 different counts. And there's indictment, there's rather perjury and beyond perjury as well here. So we'll see where that case goes. But this, if we're going to get anything out of Durham, it's going to be that we're going to see the corruption and the machinations of this Hillary Clinton smear campaign against Trump. But in this case itself, Durham's team made the case that the government was sort of duped In fact, Sussman's team made the opposite case, which was that the government, of course, knew that Sussman represented the Clinton campaign as he brought the dirt to them. So the defense here admitted that the government was in on this, yet Durham didn't make that case. I think that says it all about where this is going. It's total injustice. And as I've argued over and over again, ad nauseum, it just guarantees still worse weaponization of the national security and intelligence apparatus going forward because no one pays. And with that, I'll turn it over to everyone else for your kind of rapid reactions here.
I mean, I almost don't know what to think because I'm of two minds in a sense, in the way that like, I'm very glad that this, trial took place. I'm glad we know what we know. And I think it's unavoidable, for people that were even marginally paying attention, like how corrupt this system was, how corrupt Hillary Clinton was, all the things that we now know. But on the other hand, the fact that yet again, we're sitting here when someone did something so obviously corruptible and isn't going to jail and nobody's being punished. And that has just been the story over and over and over again, from Lois Lerner to, Kevin Kleinsmith, right? The attorney who like faked the FISA warrant to get in on Carter Page, not being even disbarred for doing so. Right. So it's just over and over and over again. And what does that do? It's like, on one hand, I'm really glad this information is out there. I'm really glad it's in the public eye, but like the fact that nobody's getting punished for it, that really starts to make people believe with concrete evidence that there's two systems of justice in America. There's the DC justice and then the one that everyone else would be exposed to if they were to do even marginally, a little bit of this. So it's the degrading effect continues.
Yeah, it feels like a banana republic. I mean, it's insane, and there's no public outcry, which is sort of what you rely on to check the excesses here. And when I say that, I mean, is a segment of the public furious about this? Yes, but it's you have to like know about it in order to be furious about it, and nobody knows about this, and that's what the like literal deep state is relying on to cover this stuff up. And yeah, you sort of have brought the Chomsky left together with the new right in following this, but it's a pretty much a total media blackout. When they do cover it, it's wrong. And they have no incentive to cover it for a number of reasons. It undercuts their political and partisan goals, but also it's an indictment of them. Because they got the story wrong and they sort of swallowed whole cloth all of these lies that people in the intelligence community were telling for years and years and years. So it isn't just purely, like oligarchic, the Clintons controlled the strings of the media. It's more just like a parallel justice system because the incentives have been so perverted and distorted over the years by, just so many different things, but mostly the ruling class protecting its power and its ability to rule. I don't know. I mean, it's shocking to me that this is happening in our country, but also at the same time, sort of tragically not shocking. It's just sort of where we are. So that's with that, I'll kick it over to Josh.
Yeah, I mean, I think tragically not shocking is unfortunately my takeaway. And I was going to go through some of the these particular details about kind of the way that this entire situation with Sussman seemed rigged from the get-go, but Ben kind of detailed that already in both on this episode and in his excellent op-ed for Newsweek last week here. But look, Rachel mentioned Lois Lerner. I mean, before Trump got rid of, Jim Comey in 2017, Jim Comey also massively got off the hook with respect to the emails and Hillary Clinton in the summer of 2016. I remember back in the middle of the Trump campaign, writing some blog post to the effect of there are two systems of justice, one for the DC class, one for everyone else. I mean, I wrote that for a blog that I don't think exists anymore. So it might've been, somewhere on the internet archives, but this has been a trend for a very long time now. And I think the even deeper and darker element here, and this is not something that new to this podcast, something we've talked about quite a bit, is that this two systems of justice paradigm does not specifically only and exclusively apply to the rule of law. It also obviously applies to big tech and online speech. It also applies to banking and financial services. I mean, whether it's deplatforming or debanking, this entire notion that there is one set of rules that pertains to the DC establishment, to the ruling class, to Beltway insiders, then one entirely separate set of rules, whether it is online speech and discourse, whether it is banking and financial services, whether it is access, potentially one day down the road to things like accounting services or medical services. I mean, who knows where this ends, right? And that really is the profoundly scary part. I mean, that is ultimately why there are some people on our side of the aisle who are so black-pilled that they use the rhetoric of national divorce, because they simply do not see an end to this madness happening anytime soon. I'm not necessarily with them at this present state when they reach that particular conclusion, but I totally understand where they're coming from, because it seems like with each particular instance, whether it's Comey in 2016, obviously, or whether it's Sussman now, it's just we need something to try to turn the tide. And, when Ron DeSantis here in Florida took on Disney in May, that seemed to me like one potential political, cultural inflection point moment with what we've seen since then, obviously with Netflix, ExxonMobil, and most recently State Farm, try to kind of more get in line. But we need some more data points like that. We need some more actions to try to de-black pill the people on our side who I think are rightfully depressed when they see all these terrible headlines, most recently the Sussman episode.
So I think with that, we can take it around to final thoughts. I can kick us off, because I think, just to pick up on what Josh said, I think that this is what troubles me the most. I'm not a national divorce proponent necessarily, but it really strikes me that sort of the link between all of our segments is that, there are two people perceive of justice now in very different ways. We talk a lot on this podcast about how we don't have a consensus on a lot of sort of the things that used to drive us forward as a country, and justice being one of those sort of virtues that we cannot agree on what that looks like anymore, whether it be in the actual justice system, right, when you have obvious examples of political corruption going unpunished, to something like, Joshua Katz at Princeton, right? There are people actively graduating from our elite tiers of universities who think justice is destroying someone's life a second time over. And what does that portend from the country? What does it portend when the biggest corporate interests in America can continue to make completely incoherent policy and legal arguments and get away with it? And so I don't know, I think I often fall back on to maybe reassure myself, and maybe this is naive, but I do think that Americans as a people are pretty smart once they sort of figure out what's going on. And, potentially that is what you're starting to see when the tide turns with Disney, when the tide turns with some of these corporations realizing there's no market outside of their own, handful of employees for a lot of these positions. And they recognize that to do business in America, they have to sort of revert back to neutrality. Maybe that's where the pendulum will swing. But in the meantime, how many heads are going to be taken off, as the pendulum continues to swing in one direction? So I think, again, this whole episode has really just been another example of how we are so divided on questions of just basic natural principles that you have to have some cohesion and unity on to run a country.
And what's interesting is I don't even know if that divide exists or how strongly it exists outside of elite circles that have amassed so much control over our politics. I mean, I think if you explained what happened with Sussman to a group of 20 people from states around the country that work outside politics and maybe just follow the news as much as they can but aren't obsessed with it, they would be appalled and would think it was absolutely wrong on single level that we know it's wrong on. And I think the same thing would be true of Joshua Katz. And I think, you would find nuance like abortion and their position on guns. So again, like just focusing on Katz and Sussman, like I don't think the country shares the elite's definitions of justice in any of these cases. And I think what's truly sad is that the people who define justice in that way have amassed so much power that they basically rigged the system in their favor. And because the media, our fourth estate, is complicit, it will just continue to happen and happen and happen. And that's where we are.
Let me just say, I'd say the kind of perverse silver lining in this is that it seems that the more millions of Americans are woke to the wokeness of our institutions and how corrupted they are, that the ruling class fears the resistance coming, but consequently they act in more brazen and tyrannical ways in response. And maybe that's delegitimizing. Maybe that's going to lead to some kind of self-correction in the system. But on the other hand, to Rachel's point, how many heads are going to roll in the interim. And I see it only getting worse the more that people are awake to what's being perpetrated against them. I was glad that Emily talked about the fact that the media here, is implicated, and that this is a self-indictment of them, not just a self-indictment in terms of their lack of coverage, but actually how they were in on this. And one thing that was revealed in the Sussman case was that there was at least one member of the media, at least according to the testimony, that was an FBI informant in the case. And the media were conduits for the narrative that the deep state wanted spun and that Hillary's team wanted spun, as if they're distinct. I mean, they're really not distinct. It's just one's a public sector actor and one's a private sector actor here. But of course, they all wanted Trump gone and dead. And they were willing to spin these stories and entertain these fantasies. Again, like we weren't in the case. I mean, silver lining of Durham for whatever happens. If there's no more trial, no more indictments hidden that we don't know about today, we know that the seventh floor, that is the senior rank of the FBI itself, was perfectly fine with digging to the ends of the earth on what they knew was dirt, what the rank and file agents knew was dirt and garbage from the start here. But I look at this, and from the media's perspective, is it an indictment of them because they got it wrong or because they got it right? Like, from the media's perspective, do they believe that they got this story right by pushing forth the dirt spun also by the government, because it was in service of the greater good, which was taking down or trying to take down the bad orange man? And same goes for the government officials. And the fact that they pay no consequence for it, again, to me, that's the real problem here, is that this just guarantees worse injustices. What was unthinkable yesterday becomes the norm today. And we keep seeing this perpetuate itself. So to me, the litmus test for leaders, future leaders, has to be, what is your plan to ensure that there is a justice system in this country anymore? What are you going to do to actually create balance again? Because looking at the institutions today, why would you ever expect that anyone's going to get a fair trial who dares to dissent from what the prevailing ruling class orthodoxy is? I mean, I think you'd be crazy to think that you're going to be treated the same way as a Michael Sussman would be treated in a court of law. And then what kind of country do you have if not? And you look at what Republicans do. Julie Kelly raised this point. The FBI is asking for incremental funds next year, growing their budget. And there was zero pushback from Republican senators in a hearing about that. What is your job if you're a senator other than oversight and controlling the purse? And if you're not going to use that power against these corrupted agencies at the highest ranks, then what's the point of having a Congress if it's just a rubber stamp? So it's incumbent upon Republican leaders to care about this issue and actually show that with concrete policies. And if you don't, you're unfit. You don't understand what time it is, or you don't care and you're complicit in it.
So I guess my final thought is picking up on something that Emily mentioned during our Uvalde follow-up segment, which is, I don't remember exactly how Emily phrased it, but it is this notion of, how grown up men can be in that situation, like those 19 police officers, and not take action to protect these children who are being wantonly slaughtered. And, Jesse Kelly had a tweet about this. We basically said, how do we raise boys, right, to be the kind of person that charges into that classroom and not stands on the sideline there. And then I also think back to this really compelling Twitter thread I thought from the Blaze's Allie Beth Stuckey, who I had on my Newsweek podcast last week in the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, where Allie Beth basically said, we are horribly failing young men of America. She was focusing not necessarily on the police conduct there. She was focusing on the shooter and the fact that all these loser, loner, murderous psychopaths oftentimes end up being these, late teens, early 20s men. But, focusing on the question of how we actually raise men. I mean, I guess at a kind of deeper kind of philosophical level, when I see 19 police officers standing outside an elementary school classroom where children are being slaughtered, and do not run in there to try to save lives, my biggest takeaway is that we are failing as not necessarily just as individuals, we're failing at that too, but also as a nation. Because to kind of go like full Yoram Hazony here, and this is NatCon squad, obviously, to kind of go like the full definition of nationhood, it ultimately depends upon the interdependent mutual bonds of loyalty that alone can sustain a citizenry, right? Think back to the Civil War, obviously. I mean, we were fighting, or at least the Union forces were fighting to preserve the Union, of course, but also to kind of, eradicate chattel slavery, to pursue kind of natural justice on behalf of those interdependent bonds of substantive loyalty. When you look at grown men who are not going to charge a classroom to go in there to save the lives of innocent children, that notion has just failed. we no longer have those bonds that sustain us when you are not willing to risk your lives, let alone risk your lives with 18 other police officers to do so. So I guess that's my biggest takeaway there. I mean, we're not going to have all the answers on this podcast there, but we surely need to do a better job, right? Obviously, there's been so much literature written about the rise of kind of fatherless homes, and the correction between fatherless homes and these psychopathic mass shooters seems to be a pretty direct and positive correlation as far as I'm concerned there. But how we can better raise young men to be the kind of police officers who will charge that classroom, not stand there on the sidelines like total, cowardly, words I don't want to use in this podcast. I think that is kind of one question that the listeners and viewers of this podcast, as well as the four of us and everyone out there, really for that matter, should be thinking long and hard about over the next few months.
Yeah, to not leave us on a complete note of despair. I think Josh's points are well taken. There's work here to be done. And I think the country in many ways, and the people who make it up, especially our young men, tend to be on the brink of nihilism in so many areas. And I think it's our job and our duty to force the conversation back, to pull them back from the brink and to pull the country back from the brink. So I am happy to be joined in that endeavor by all of you. So on behalf of Ben, Josh, and Emily, we'll see you on the next NatCon Squad.